Back here in the U.S. now, we have new reporting tonight on that mysterious death of an 18-year-old Nolan Wells. For the first time tonight, we now hear from one of the last people to see him alive.
Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing? That's the line everyone thought belonged to Nolan Wells. A voice caught on video, mid-argument, mid-panic, on the last day anyone saw him alive. For over a week, that clip has been treated like a smoking gun. And now, the story behind it has just changed completely. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. 2 days after he disappeared on a 4th of July boat trip, his body was pulled from the water off Horn Island, Mississippi. And as of right now, nobody, not the state medical examiner, not an independent pathologist flown in from Washington, D.C., not the sheriff's department, has told his parents how their son actually died. If that doesn't unsettle you, I don't know what will. Before we go further, I need 30 seconds of your time. Every case we cover on this channel represents a real family living through the worst moment of their lives. Nolan cooked his mother salmon the night before he disappeared. He hugged her, told her he loved her, and walked out the door for what he thought was a normal holiday weekend with friends. He never came home. If you want more of these cases investigated with the depth and respect they deserve, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and drop a like before we continue. It genuinely helps get stories like this in front of people who think critically instead of just reacting. It's the least we can do for a family still waiting for answers. Okay, let's get into it. To understand what might have happened to Nolan, you have to understand who he was. Because the gap between his character and the explanations he's been given is where this entire case lives. Nolan Xavier Wells played wide receiver at Ocean Springs High School, then moved on to Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he was gearing up to return for another season. His coach called him the kind of player every program hopes for. Not the loudest guy in the room, but the one people naturally followed. A silent leader. His parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, described someone who was almost allergic to conflict. His mother said Nolan wasn't someone who liked fights, physical or verbal. His father remembers him, as a toddler, breaking into a dance in the middle of his parents arguing just to defuse the tension in the room. Hold on to that detail, because it matters later. There's also a rule his father drilled into him from childhood. If you go out with a group, you come home with that group. 5 goes out, 5 comes back. And by every account, Nolan actually listened, not the type to wander off, not the type to separate from his friends on a whim. So here's the setup. On July 4th, Nolan went out on a boat with a tight circle of friends he'd known since freshman year of high school to Horn Island, an undeveloped barrier island roughly 7 miles off the Mississippi coast. No lifeguards, no cell service, no facilities, just sand, water, and around 200 people scattered across the island that day. The trip had been planned as one last hurrah before everyone scattered back to school or work. According to his friend Trace's Tin Shepherd, who has since spoken publicly, the group had been drinking since late morning after multiple boats full of friends arrived for the outing. And at some point that day, Nolan met a young woman. Shepherd says that's why Nolan chose to stay behind when the others headed back, because of boat trouble. They met that day, and it's kind of one of those things, Shepherd said. Now on the surface, that's a fairly ordinary teenage story. Guy meets girl, decides to stay a little longer. But remember what we just established. This was someone raised and never separate from the group. Someone his own father says always agreed to that rule without pushback. So even in the most innocent version of this story, something departed from Nolan's normal pattern that day. And that's important, because in behavioral analysis, it's rarely the big obvious red flags that matter most. It's the small departures from someone's established baseline. A person who never misses a check-in call, suddenly not calling. A person who always keeps his word about curfew, suddenly breaking it. Those tiny inconsistencies are often what investigators and families fixate on because they know that person better than anyone else in the room. Let's build the timeline, because this is where things start to fracture. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, the group's boat developed an issue with its bilge pump and was taking on water. According to a friend's mother, who is a local judge and has spoken publicly to try to calm the situation, her son and the rest of the group left the island at that point, and Nolan stayed behind, planning to catch a ride back later with another group of friends. Around 11 that night, one of Nolan's friends called the Coast Guard. They say that call did not require their assistance. Around midnight, Nolan's mother, having heard nothing, contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Department herself. It wasn't until around 12:30 the next afternoon, more than 13 hours after that first Coast Guard call, that the sheriff's office formally requested Coast Guard assistance in the search. Nolan's father didn't wait for that. He got in his own boat the next morning and went looking for his son. The search expanded to multiple agencies, including the Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and United Cajun Navy, a volunteer group that knows these waters better than almost anyone. One searcher described the area where Nolan was last seen as treacherous in a very specific way. You could be standing in 3 feet of water and take a few steps, and suddenly you're in 20 feet of water. If someone got caught in a rip current there, it could happen fast, and without anyone on a crowded beach even noticing. That's one explanation, a tragic accident. But here's where the psychology of this case gets complicated, and where the story has shifted the most since we first covered it. For over a week, the central piece of evidence driving public suspicion was a video. Family attorney Ben Crump described footage of an argument on the island where a voice several people identified as Nolan's could be heard demanding his phone back. That single clip fueled an enormous amount of speculation. What was the fight about? Who took his phone? Why would he need to fight to get it back if he'd voluntarily decided to stay on the island? Then Nolan's close friend, Trace's Tin Shepard, went on Good Morning America and gave a completely different account, under his own name, on camera. Shepard says that's his voice in the video, not Nolan's. He says there was no talk about a phone at all. What actually happened, according to Shepard, is that he got into a fight with a stranger on the island, and the yelling everyone's been analyzing for over a week was him telling 2 people who were physically restraining him, his friend Javon Williams and a family member, to let him go so he could continue the fight. Shepard says Nolan wasn't even on the island at that specific moment. Sit with that for a second, because if true, it means the piece of evidence that most people online have treated as proof of something sinister happening to Nolan specifically was actually unrelated to him. It was a separate altercation, involving separate people, misattributed to Nolan because of how chaotic and fast that day was, and how desperately the internet wanted a villain and a victim in the same frame. This is where it's worth pausing on a phenomenon behavioral analysts see constantly in high-profile cases like this. When there's a vacuum of confirmed information, people don't just wait patiently. Their brains actively resist uncertainty. Psychologists call this need for cognitive closure, the drive to reach a firm answer, any answer, rather than tolerate ambiguity. A blurry video with raised voices becomes definitive proof of a struggle. A random photo becomes definitive proof someone survived the night. It's not that people are acting in bad faith, most of the time. It's that ambiguity is uncomfortable, and a dramatic explanation, even an unverified one, feels better than no explanation at all. Shepard also addressed the phone question directly. He says Nolan put his phone on the boat's dash before getting into the water that day, alongside roughly 15 other phones belonging to other people in the group. Shepard's uncle, who was piloting one of the boats and asked not to be named, backed this up, saying it's completely normal in the boating community to just leave your phone somewhere and forget about it for hours. That's not uncommon, he said. I've even gotten home and had phones on my deck. I didn't know whose they were. Out there, they can give a care less about their phone. That reframes something we flagged as suspicious last time, the fact that Nolan's mother found his phone at a friend's house on land, using a location tracking app. If 15 phones were sitting on a boat dash that day, it's entirely plausible his phone simply went home with whoever was gathering everyone's belongings, not as part of any cover-up, but as an ordinary side effect of a chaotic group outing. Now here's the twist that actually changes the shape of this entire case. A photo went viral, shared by Crump himself on Instagram, appearing to show Nolan at a pool party. The internet ran with it immediately, believing it was taken in the early morning hours of July 5th, meaning Nolan had somehow made off the island and back to mainland before he died. Crump posted it with a disclaimer, saying he didn't know if it was fact or rumor, but that leads had to be followed. The photo spread anyway, treated by many as proof Nolan survived the boat trip entirely and died under completely different circumstances later that night. Shepard says that photo isn't from July 5th at all. He told Rolling Stone it's actually from a separate pool party that took place on June 27th, more than a week before Nolan disappeared. Shepard didn't attend that party himself, but he knew about it in advance, since his friend group had been planning it for a while, and he was able to identify Nolan and their other friends in the photo. He says a friend posted it as part of a photo dump of recent memories, and deleted it once the death rumors started circulating and people mistakenly connected it to July 4th. Think about what that means psychologically for a second. In the absence of real answers, the public built an entire alternate timeline for Nolan's final hours, based on a photo that was 10 days old. That's not a minor mix-up. That's a case study in how desperate people become for narrative closure, and how quickly a piece of ambiguous media can get slotted into whatever story people already want to believe, whether that's an innocent accident or something far darker. It also shows how misinformation compounds. Once one detail from that photo got accepted as true, other people built new theories on top of it, each one slightly further from anything verified, until the original, shakier claim was buried under layers of speculation that felt solid simply because so many people were repeating it. Shepard has said watching this happen has been almost as painful as losing his best friend. His words were unbelievable and heartbreaking. He's also pushed back hard on the racial framing Crump has introduced into the case, saying it's made him and his friends targets of public anger, despite what he insists is total innocence in the group. Nobody would ever hurt Nolan in our friend group, he said. We would die for him. So where does that leave us? There's still real friction here that hasn't been resolved. Sheriff Ledbetter told ABC News that Crump's team still hasn't turned over Nolan's actual phone to investigators, more than a week into the case. Crump has said the family plans to hand it over once their own independent investigation wraps up. That's a legitimate point of tension. Whatever is or isn't on that device, withholding it from law enforcement while simultaneously citing its contents publicly through an attorney creates exactly the kind of asymmetry that fuels distrust on both sides. It also puts investigators in an unusual position, forced to respond to claims about evidence they haven't actually been allowed to examine themselves. There's also still no cause of death. The state autopsy is waiting on toxicology. The independent D.C. autopsy, paid for by Colin Kaepernick specifically, so the family could have someone with zero ties to Mississippi law enforcement examine their son, was expected the Friday after Nolan's death, but got delayed due to canceled flights. As of now, neither report has been released. And there's still the unresolved question of exactly what happened between 3 in the afternoon, when Nolan was last confirmed seen, and Monday morning when his body surfaced. Shepard's account clears up the video and the phone. It does not tell us how Nolan ended up in the water, or why. If he was a strong swimmer, as his father maintains, he didn't make it out. What this update really shows us is how a single ambiguous piece of media, in this case a video and a photo, can completely hijack a family's grief and a community's understanding of events. For over a week, a lot of people online believed they had heard direct evidence of Nolan in distress, fighting for his own phone. Now, according to someone who was actually there and has put his name and face to his statement, that evidence may have had nothing to do with Nolan at all. That doesn't mean Shepard's account is automatically the full truth either. He's a friend of the group under public pressure, giving an interview at a moment when he and his friends have become targets of online anger. His account deserves scrutiny just like every other piece of this puzzle, the same way Crump's initial framing deserved scrutiny. Neither position gets a free pass just because one came from a grieving family's attorney, and the other came from a grieving friend on camera. But a formal on-camera, named statement to investigators and the national media does sit in a different category than an anonymous video clip or a reposted photo with a shaky caption. And that distinction matters when you're trying to weigh competing accounts. So here's what I want to leave you with, because this case is still completely open. Why did an unrelated altercation, involving a different person entirely, get misattributed to Nolan and go viral as if it proved something happened to him specifically? Why did a photo from over a week earlier get treated as proof he survived the night, simply because someone thought they recognized his face? And psychologically, what does it say about all of us that in the absence of real information, we'd rather build a detailed false narrative than sit with genuine uncertainty? Is that human nature? Is that grief looking for shape? Or is that something more troubling about how quickly a story can spiral once it leaves the hands of investigators and land in the hands of the internet? I want to know what you think, not as a verdict, because nobody outside the actual investigation has enough to deliver one, but as a theory worth discussing with some care. Do you think this points toward a tragic accident with a lot of noise around it? Or do you think there's still something deliberately being hidden underneath all this misinformation? Put your thinking in the comments, and if this case develops further by the time you're watching this, tell us, because we're going to keep following it. If you want more cases broken down to the lens of psychology and human behavior, instead of just headlines, subscribe to Psychology of Crime, and we'll keep digging until a full picture comes into focus.